Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Howard, for being flexible on that. Most people know not to call me in certain hours. Most people are at church during those hours, so I don't have to worry about that a whole lot. And I'll just forget to take it off silent when I actually hit the little button to put it on silent. Sorry, I apologize. So right now we are studying Ezra and Nehemiah. As a congregation, we have been looking to look towards the future. We want to be a people who are looking towards the future, who are forward-looking.
We don't want to be stuck in the past. We don't want to be consumed with what we used to do or what we used to be involved in. We want to be a people who are constantly striving towards the future. So far this year, as we have done that, we have had small changes that we have already done, right? We have moved our announcements on Sunday morning from the beginning towards the end. We have begun singing on the last Sunday night of each month. These are small changes that I hope everybody's like, yeah, those are awesome. But sometimes those small changes can cause a little bit of anxiety. It's different. It's maybe a little bit uncomfortable. So as we strive to look towards the future, we want to be making wise decisions. We want to be seeking to not just make changes for change's sake, but instead we want to make changes that are going to be a blessing to all and to achieving the goals that we have set for this year. We want to be intentional about our time usage as well this year. We only have a small amount of time that we're gathered together each week. We live very busy lives. So we want even our Sunday night sermon series to reflect what we're discussing, what we're striving for as a congregation. And I believe that our study of Ezra and Nehemiah will help us to navigate some of these changes, navigate some of these bumpy waters that may arise as we strive to achieve the goals that we want to achieve this year. Ezra and Nehemiah, to an extent, are a case study of change. We have an entire nation that had been disrupted, an entire religion that had been disrupted for over 48 years. To some, it had been 70 years plus, and they're returning back to their homeland. They're reestablishing all these things. And it's one of those things that this is really a case study in change, in reestablishing, of renewal. And to that extent, I think we can learn a lot from this study. Last week, I mentioned that Ezra and Nehemiah were on one continuous scroll, so they seem to be one work, probably compiled by an author a little bit later on. I believe that Ezra was probably written by Ezra himself and then compiled, maybe by Nehemiah. Nehemiah was definitely the author of Nehemiah, but those two works seem to be compiled and arranged in such a way to reflect a narrative, and we're looking at that narrative as a whole. Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi also cover the same kind of time span. So over a period of about 100 years, we have all of these different books that are covering basically the same story arc of what God is doing in this time frame. So we have a lot of material, and it's hard to kind of piece everything together. In the back on one of these tables, I have a timeline that I found online. I didn't put it together. There's two different papers, two different independent people who put these timelines together. I found them helpful in my study. I thought I would share them with you. I'm still wrestling through exactly what these timelines should look like, what's accurate to what the text says, but I've found those very helpful in my study. So I printed off some and left those out there for us to look at. Ezra and Nehemiah cover three main leaders of Israelite history. We start off with Zerubbabel, and then we have Ezra, and then we have Nehemiah. Now, very little is known about Zerubbabel, and as we get into the text this evening, we're going to see one of the reasons why we know so little about him. So let's jump into chapter 1. Now, I'm not going to be reading the entirety of the text. We're going to cover about 2.5 chapters tonight. So keep your Bibles open, keep your eyes on the text. Feel free to ask me questions after service this evening, but I'm going to read a little bit out of each chapter. We're going to talk about the chapter as a whole. So Ezra, chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the first year of King Cyrus of the Persians, that the word of the Lord might be fulfilled by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom and put it in writing. Ezra and Nehemiah begin with this fulfillment of prophecy, that after 70 years of captivity, the Israelites would be restored back or have an opportunity to return back to the land of promise. Now, last week I talked a little bit about the fact that I believe that there is a theology behind King Cyrus and why he made these decisions. But I am by no means suggesting that we should not see the hand of God at work here. God it fully is at work. He knew Cyrus's name before Cyrus was even born. God is ultimately at work here. He knows what Cyrus is going to do. He's the one working in Cyrus's life to prompt this. So God is the one at work. He's the one who is fulfilling prophecy. He's the one saying, return my people back to the land. You are to do this. Now, Cyrus has a theology. He has his reasons for doing this. But God ultimately is the one at work behind the scenes. Now, as we read through this declaration of King Cyrus, one of the things that we see is what, like I said last week, appears to be a belief in God. But we also see that he backs up his desire for the Jews to return home to praise God on his behalf so that he might have the favor of the God of Israel. He puts his words into action by returning a great amount of wealth that was stolen from the temple, these items of worship that really would have expedited the worship or the return to worship of the Israelites. So we have here at the end, 1,000 wash basins, 28 censers, 30 bowls of gold. I don't know about you, but I would take one bowl of gold, right? I mean, that would be like a retirement package. I mean, there's a ton of money that is transferring hands. So the kingdom is willing to part with a lot of treasure that some might argue shouldn't have been taken in the first place, and that must have been the opinion of King Cyrus. But he makes this declaration and sends the Jews back to the land, and he backs up his words with action by allowing them to take these special religious items back to their temple, back with them to the land of Israel. Now, they are led by a man by the name of Zerubbabel, and we know very little about him. In fact, probably the reason that we focus on him is because of what is written in the book of Haggai. So if you haven't read that, I'd encourage you to read that. That's an interesting study. But let's get into the text as we jump into chapter 2. In Ezra chapter 2, starting in verse 1, "And now these were the people of the province who came up out of captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried into captivity to Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and to Judea, and each to his own town. And they came with Zerubbabel, Joshua, Nehemiah, lots of hard names here, Rima, Makas, Beshem, Mishpa, Begin, Haggai, and Benaniah. And if you have better pronunciations, get with me afterwards. I'm sure there's some in our midst who can pronounce some of these Middle Eastern names a little bit better than I can. The point is they returned, and there was a number of leaders, 11 leaders, 11 names, and several of which I butchered poorly this evening, who led the people of Israel back. So Zerubbabel is only one of 11 leaders who are leading the people back. Now, as you go through the rest of chapter 2, you're going to see a lot of names, and you're going to see a lot of numbers. And this is one of those places where you quickly get into a study of Ezra and Nehemiah, and your head hits the table because you just get bored. Now, why are there all these names? I mean, honestly, it's kind of boring. Our eyes just kind of glaze over when we look at these long lists. Well, one, let's give the author credit where credit is due. Over about a page, he covers and records in what we might consider very exact detail a list of people returning who number about 50,000 people. So that's a pretty good summation of a detailed list of 50,000 people returning to the land of Israel. Depending on some different things at play, a little bit later on there's going to be a donation of money to the temple. of 61,000. So it's possible that with children and some other numbers in there and women who've accompanied, that maybe the number got up to the 61,000 people who had returned. There's a lot of folks that are returning to the land. And we need to remember that they have to reestablish their lives, right? This is taking place in real time and space. They're returning to a land that some of them may never have known. There are some who are returning, and we're going to see this next week, who did return, who saw the temple, who did come out of the Babylonian captivity. But many of these are the descendants of those who have been carried off into Babylonian captivity. They have only known the Babylonian Empire and now the Persian Empire and the Median Empire. So they are returning to a land that is foreign to them, that they've lived all their life in one location. Now they're moving, right? And they're moving back into maybe broken down homes or into an environment that they are unfamiliar with, where there's people who are living there and existing there, and maybe not in a full nation capacity, but in a subsistence society, and they're trying to reestablish these things. So this is a difficulty that they're walking into. So once again, let's return to this question. Why so many names? Well, it seems to be recording each head of the family who had been carried off into captivity. Seems to be the inclination. So they seem to be giving the name of the descendant or the place of the descendants who were carried off into Babylonian captivity, who are returning. Now, there's one specifically that's a little bit hard for us to swallow if we look at this and say, well, how can this one person have this many descendants? There's one in here, and I'm not exactly sure where it's at. I'm just kind of scanning at the moment. That's 3,600 people. Here it is in verse 35. The sons of Shinan, 3,630 people are said to be his descendants. That's a lot of folks for a family reunion. How can this one person over the period of 70 years have that many descendants? That kind of throws a kink in that plan. Well, I went online and I found a calculator for generations and how many descendants and things. You would need 14 kids per generation to achieve that number of folks. So it's plausible. I'm not saying that's necessarily doable, but they did live in a different time, right? We're talking about a nation whose great-great-great-grandfather had 12 kids, right? 12 sons who had more sons and became a great multitude and numerated Egypt to the point that Pharaoh got a little nervous. So this is very possible. And there seems to be a distinction between the sons of and the men of. So the men of seems to indicate a place from which they're coming, and the sons of seems to indicate a descendant from whom came or who was brought out of captivity. So we seem to be talking about a group of people. So we're talking about records, we're talking about a right of God bringing them back, and I think ultimately what we need to get out of chapter 2 is the sovereignty of God, right? God himself sovereignly said, you have broke my law, you have abandoned my covenant, I am going to send you off into captivity. And that saved sovereignty of God is what is bringing the people back into the land. And they are recording it in very distinct detail, the fact that they're bringing these people back. Now, one of the things that's interesting also in chapter 2 is found in verse 59 to 30, or in verse 59 to 63. And here we have a group of people who want to join the exiles, and do join the exiles, who are claiming to be descendants of the priests. What's interesting about this is that their claim to be these descendants is questioned and brought into question. And they are not allowed to join the order of the priest until after the religious ceremonies are reestablished and they're able to go before God with the correct inquiring methods to be able to find out if indeed this is true. So apparently there was a discrepancy in their documentation and their papers to prove that they indeed were a descendant of the priests. Now, there's a debate that comes up as we study through Ezra and Nehemiah that we may come back to this text, and there's several explanations possible here. One is that these Jews, as they return, are way too caught up in the concept of ethnical purity, that they're concerned more about genetics than they are about religious observance. And I think there's some validity to that. But I think as we look at this, we also see that it's possible that they're just concerned about the priesthood aspect of this. And I think this is a legitimate question to raise here specifically. And it's one of the things that I bring up with people who want to say, well, let's reestablish the temple in Jerusalem. We're waiting for that day when God will reestablish the priesthood. Well, we can't. That's one of the points of 70 AD and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem then, was that all the records were destroyed. We don't know who the priests are. We're 2,000 years removed, and all we have is hearsay. If it wasn't good enough for them to be priests then, it sure isn't good enough now just to say, well, my great-great-grandfather said that we are descended of Aaron. Well, that's apparently not good enough. So I think there is some validity to that. God said only those who are from Aaron are to be the priests and the high priests. You can't just make a claim and start serving. So there seems to be some legitimate questioning as to why they're raising this question. But as you go throughout the rest of the book, and as we get into this really sticky question later on about the divorcing of the foreign wives, it begins to be a question of, was it for religious reasons or for ethic purity reason, right, for their genetics? And if it's for genetics, I don't think the rest of Scripture really backs up that decision. If it was for religious reasons, that they weren't following, that they hadn't converted to following Yahweh, then maybe there was some legitimate religious reasons for that. So it's an interesting thing to take note of as well. Now, like I said, there is time that as they enter into the land that they need to settle in. Right? It takes time to establish a home and to unpack and to settle in. And if you're not able to go down to the local supermarket, you need to be establishing, some crops so that you have some food to eat through the winter and things. So there's some reasons why it's going to take them some time to settle into the land. And this becomes important as we look at chapter 3. So let's start here starting in verse 1. When the 7th month came, and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man in Jerusalem. There arose Jehu, the son of Zadok, boy, I'm butchering these names tonight, I'm sorry, which his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, with his kinsmen, and they built the altar of God in Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written to the law of Moses, the man of God. So as we enter into chapter 3, we have the reestablishing of the sacrificial system. Now, the reason I question when they arrived is because they say in the 7th month. Well, in the 7th month, we have the several sacrifices or several festivals that the Jews would normally hold, and they hold those in the text that follows. So the question then arises, well, did they arrive earlier in the year and miss ceremonies and take care of their houses, or were they entering the land, say, maybe in the 3rd month, in which case they would have just missed Passover? They could have had time to plant their crops, and then as they enter the end of the harvest, they would naturally come to the Feast of Booths, where they could then offer these sacrifices on time. So it's very possible that depending on how all of this fell, that they've been there for a couple months. They arrived maybe sometime after the 3rd month, and then now by the 7th month, this is the very first religious festival that the Jews are supposed to hold. So they all come to Jerusalem like they're supposed to, and then they're like, well, we don't have a temple, and we don't have an altar. Regardless of kind of what's going on here timeline-wise, which is more a question of curiosity than a question of real importance, what we see here, I think, is one of our best principles that we can kind of wrestle with here. It had been 48 years. It had been 48 years since the last sacrifices took place in the temple. From the first destruction of Jerusalem and Nebuchadnezzar carried off Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to this point, to the point where the temple was destroyed, to this point, that we have from that destruction of the temple completely in the 3rd exile to now is about approximately 48 years, give or take. So for them to reestablish sacrifices was quite a big deal. Now, you look back at Israel's history, God probably wasn't necessarily pleased with the last couple years of Israel's sacrifices to him, right? That's one of the reasons they were carried off into captivity, is because they were desecrating his holy place, right? They had failed to follow the law. So God wasn't necessarily pleased, but it had been 80 or 48 years since a sacrifice had been offered to God upon the altar in Jerusalem, or really anywhere. So this is quite a momentous occasion. Now, what I think we need to take note of is that they don't have a temple yet. They haven't even begun to lay the foundation stones of the temple. They come to Jerusalem, presumably after kind of establishing themselves in the land, providing provisions for themselves, doing some farming and cultivating and building work so that they could survive through the whole year. And they come to the temple, and Zerubbabel and his guys come together, these three leaders, and they build the altar. They reestablish the sacrificial system. Now, I think the principle we take from that is they went to basics, right? They didn't have a tabernacle. They didn't have a temple. For the first time in their history, after a 48-year break, they reestablish with the bare bones necessities. They rebuild the altar, and they return as best they can to fulfilling the law with what they had available. And I think that's something that we should take note of. I think that's something that we need to kind of wrestle with a little bit, that there's an aspect of when we have dreams, when we have goals, when we have ambitions, we can't always execute those as well as we would like. We might have grandiose plans of we could do this and we could do that, but we only have the ability to do this. Well, I guess we can't do it to the best of our ability, so we're not going to do it at all. Well, that's not Zerubbabel's take on this. He went and he did what he could, right? It's time for this time of worship and celebration to God here in Israel. We're back in the land. We've taken care, presumably, of planting some fields and kind of establishing ourselves in the land. It's time that we get back to religious worship. Well, we need an altar. So they reestablish the altar. And I think it's a principle for us to figure out, okay, what's the bare bones basics sometimes to carry out a plan, to carry out an objective? What do we really basically need in order to be effective in doing this ministry or that ministry? One of the things that comes to my mind is YouTube. And if you're an avid YouTube watcher and you kind of follow a few different guys, if you ever go back and you begin to watch their very first stuff, unless you actually started with one of these YouTubers, if you go all the way back to their first stuff, it's almost painful to watch, right? The camera quality is horrible. The audio quality is horrible. There's this one guy, he's brilliant when it comes to motors and electronics and engineering stuff. And his first videos have absolutely no explanation. It's just a camera. And it was so painful to sit there and actually watch his videos because they were just poorly done, right? But now, he's excellent, right? Just phenomenal. And it's amazing to think that he went from this to that, right? We're not going to be where we ultimately want to be. Sometimes we have to start with those bare bone basics. And I think that's an important principle for us to understand as they reestablish their worship to God. They haven't laid the foundation stones of the temple. They haven't done much but probably clear and purify the land there at the temple location. They rebuild the altar, and they get to doing what they need to do, which is worshiping God and celebrating Him at this Feast of Sukkot. So how do we take all of this then, and how do we apply this to our lives? Well, hopefully, one of the things that we see here is the sovereignty of God. Like I said, God was the one who brought them out of the land because of their sin. He's the one who's bringing them back. And I think we need to acknowledge the sovereignty of God and how He is working in the situation. We know very little about the leadership of these 11 men, much less Zerubbabel. We don't know who these guys are, what their background is in great part. There's all sorts of questions, honestly, that we are left with as we read through the text. But what we hopefully see is that God is the one at work. Years and years before Cyrus was even born, God prophesied that he would be his servant. 70 years after they had been carried off into captivity the first time, God, right on cue, the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the rise of Cyrus, and Cyrus issuing this decree. We see the sovereignty of God restoring families and generations back to the land. I hope that we also see a desire to, let's see here. Sorry, I'm looking through my notes here. I hope we're constantly looking towards the future. Right? I hope we're people who are looking towards the future. We have a account of 50,000 plus people who are returning to the land, looking towards a bright hope in a future, looking to see their temple rebuilt, looking to see the foundation stones relaid, to once again be able to worship God according to His Word. I see a group of people who had plans and a vision, and they began with something that is so simple, so bare bones, so basic, right? Just the altar. I mean, that's calling back all the way to the days of Abraham when he just kind of was a nomad and put some rocks together and made an altar. I mean, they went to a greater depth and detail, I think, in their construction of this altar, but like all they had was the altar. All they had was the location. They didn't have the temple. They didn't have any of this other stuff. They had plans, but they were willing to start with what they had available, where they were able to start. And I think that's a call for us, and I think that's something that we should remember, that sometimes good enough is better than nothing, ultimately. And I think if we think back to our own beginnings, and especially like the coat drive, right? It started very humbly, very simple, right? If we had begun with these grandiose plans, we would have never gotten started. But because we've taken baby steps over the years and done what we can and had a vision to serve and kept our eyes on the prize, year after year, we've been able to serve our community quite well. And I think we see that in Ezra and Nehemiah and their willingness to start with the bare bone basics. You know, they got their homes kind of in order, not in great detail, but they got, provisions. It would be my estimation, and I'm kind of reading into the text here as I'm studying through. It's got to be practical, right? But ultimately, the first account that's recorded, other than them returning to the land, is that in the 7th month, I don't know what took place before that, but in the 7th month, they set their minds to serving the Lord. And they put first things first, and they established this sacrificial system, which was essential for their worship of God to be pleasing to them. Hopefully, that's been a blessing to us. And I hope that we can take that with us this week, that we understand the sovereignty of God in our own lives, that we're looking for that sovereignty of God, and that we're willing to start with maybe that bare bones basics, to do what we can, what those missions that God has placed on our heart will begin with those simple things. And I hope that that will be what we will do. As always, if there's any way that we can serve you, if there's a way that we can pray for you as a member of our congregation, we invite you to let those needs be known as we stand and sing. But I challenge you this week to go and do the simple things that God is calling you to do.